Part 4. Africa in the World. Chapter 8. Crazy Soup. Johnny Good-Looking? In the 1520s, a solitary man constructed a small chapel on the Western Highway out of Mexico City, just beyond the causeway that led to the city's western gate. No description of the chapel survives, but it was probably just 2 whitewashed adobe rooms, one for the shrine itself with an altar and cross, one for the man who built and maintained it. Nearby were a few small fields on which he grew crops. The structure was known as the Chapel of the Martyrs, or more impressively, the Chapel of the 11,000 Martyrs. It may have been the first Christian church in mainland America. The man in the chapel was named Juan Garrido. Almost the only thing we know about the background of this Spanish man is that he was not Spanish and his name was not Garrido. The first hint of his existence in the historical record comes from 1477, when João II, the future king and current regent of Portugal, granted freedom to an African slave who called himself João Garrido. João is the Portuguese equivalent of Juan or John. Enslaved as a boy and taught Portuguese, João had served as an interpreter on several slaving ventures before jumping ship in Guinea or southern Mauritania from a desire to be free and not to return again to being a slave, unquote. Yet Garrido didn't want to be free in Africa. Instead, he boldly sought to return to Portugal, possibly because he was a Berber, a lighter-skinned North African ethnic group that was often at odds with darker African groups to the south. I owe this suggestion to Alistair Saunders, the historian who found Garrido's Freedom Papers. End of parentheses. Garrido must have been a valuable interpreter. The future king made him absolutely free like any other Christian Portuguese, on the condition that he continue working in the slave trade. This was João Garrido, the Juan Garrido who later built a chapel in Mexico. Most likely not, according to Matthew Restel, a Pennsylvania State University historian who's also studied Garrido's life. It would have meant that he was almost 60 years old when he came to Mexico. But the name of Garrido was uncommon among the tens of thousands of slaves in the Iberian Peninsula. It is likely that the two men were connected. The Spanish one could have been João's son or cousin, Restel suggests. Or, Saunders asks, was the Juan Garrido in Mexico one of the black slaves brought back from Africa by the newly freed Berber or mulatto João Garrido, who also received the name João and adopted his master's surname when he in turn was freed? Like his father, uncle, or former master, this Juan Garrido had an eye for the main chance. Rather than remaining in Portugal, he crossed the Spanish border, arriving just after Colón revealed the existence of the Americas to Europe. He spent 7 years in Sevilla, the center of Spain's growing American trade. Something of his personality is hinted at by the name he and his predecessor had chosen to live under, Juan Garrido, which means, more or less, Johnny Good-Looking. Johnny Good-Looking crossed the Atlantic early in the 16th century, according to his biographer Ricardo E. Alegria, an anthropologist in Puerto Rico. He landed in Hispaniola. As aggressive and ambitious as any other conquistador, a young man with his blood aboil, he quickly attached himself to a local sub-governor, Juan Ponce de León y Figueroa, accompanying him on a mission to take over the island of Puerto Rico. When Ponce de León sank his fortune into an off-kilter hunt for the Fountain of Youth, Garrido joined the futile quest. Along the way, they became the first people from the opposite shore of the Atlantic to touch down on Florida. When Spain launched punitive expeditions against Carib Indians on half a dozen Caribbean islands, Garrido brought his gun. And when Hernan Cortes seized the Triple Alliance, Johnny Goodlookin was at his side. The alliance is more commonly known as the Aztec Empire, but the term is a 19th century invention and historians increasingly avoid it. It was a consortium of 3 militarized city-states in the middle of Mexico: Texcoco, Tlacopan, and Tenochtitlan. The last by far the most powerful partner. When the Spaniards arrived, this triple alliance ruled central Mexico from ocean to ocean, and Tenochtitlan, I can't say it, was bigger and richer than any city in Spain. As canny a politician as he was a fighter, Cortes was able to foment an assault on the empire by its many enemies and place himself at its head. But despite taking the Triple Alliance Emperor hostage in his own palace, a paralyzing surprise to the enemy, the initial assault failed calamitously. Indeed, the Spaniards barely escaped the Tenochtitlan. When it all seemed lost, Cortes had a stroke of luck. The accidental introduction of the smallpox virus, never before seen in the Americas, transmittable with horrific ease. The virus swept through densely packed central Mexico, killing a third or more of its population in a few months. As the Triple Alliance reeled from the epidemic, the Spanish Indian Army attacked the capital a second time in May 1521 with as many as 200,000 troops. Tenochtitlan occupied a Venice-like clump of islands, many of them human-made, on the west side of an 80-mile-long, artificially recontoured lake. Spider-webbing from the metropolis was an intricate network of causeways, dikes, dams, baffles, and channels that both kept back floods during the wet season and funneled water around the city during the dry season. Cortes's strategy was in part to avoid the heavily defended causeways into the city by draining and filling the moat-like channels around them, thus creating dry land from which he could assault less protected areas of the perimeter. During the siege, the attackers repeatedly tore out dikes and piled up stones and earth during the day, and the Triple Alliance repeatedly reassembled the dikes and reflooded the channels at night. On June 30th, the alliance set a trap at the shore entrance to Tenochtitlan's western causeway, undermining a bridge that crossed a shallow, reed-thick waterway. When the attackers charged across the bridge, wrote the 16th century chronicler Diego Duran, the entire thing collapsed, together with the Spaniards and Indians who stood upon it. From hiding places in the reeds shot canoes loaded with men wielding bows, spears, and stolen Spanish swords. Flailing in the brackish water, the Spaniards and their horses were easy prey. Cortes himself was wounded and almost captured. As the surviving attackers fled to safety, they heard the boom of an enormous drum, so vast in its dimensions. The conquistador Bernal Diaz del Castillo later recalled that it could be heard from 8 to 12 miles distance. The Spaniards spun on their heels. Across the water, they could see Triple Alliance soldiers dragging Spanish prisoners, still dripping from the watery ambush, to the summit of a great pyramidal temple. In an act meant to terrify and demoralize, Alliance soldiers and priests ripped open the captives' chests, tore out their hearts, and kicked the bodies down the temple steps. The next morning, they marched another prisoner, a handsome Sevillan, Duran wrote, to the edge of the channel and in full view of his friends, ripped him to bits then and there. When Tenochtitlan fell, Cortes had his revenge. He stood by as his troops and their native allies despoiled the shattered city, slaughtering the men and raping the women. Juan Garrido may have been at the ambush or known the sacrificed Spaniards, or both. In any case, he was asked by Cortes to build the Chapel of the Martyrs, a monument and graveyard for fallen conquistadors on the spot where the ambush took place. The assignment was but one of many, for Garrido soon became one of the conqueror's go-to men as he erected Spanish Mexico City literally atop the wreckage of Indian Tenochtitlan. Johnny Goodlooking became a kind of major domo for the new municipal government, protector of the trees that shaded the highways into town. The records give no reason for their position, but one can guess the trees were being cut for fuel. Guardian of the main city water supply. Tenochtitlan, which had no water of its own, was supplied via aqueduct from the mountain springs. And town crier, a position, Restel says, that could include the duties of a constable, auctioneer, executioner, piper, master of weights, responsible for assaying silver and gold, and doorkeeper or guard. As Langniep, Garrido accompanied Cortez in 1535 on the latter's ill-fated attempt to cross Mexico and sail to China, the ultimate goal of Spanish adventurers. Garrido's biggest contribution occurred after Cortez found 3 kernels of bread wheat, triticum estivum, in a sack of rice that had been sent from Spain. The conqueror asked his go-to man to plant them in a plot near the chapel that served as a kind of experimental farm. 2 of them grew. The historian Francisco Lopez de Gomera reported in 1552, quote, "And one of them produced 180 kernels. They later turned around and planted those kernels, and little by little there was boundless wheat. One kernel yields 100, 300, and even more with irrigation and sowing by hand. To a black man and slave is owed so much benefit." Unquote. Wheat was not only desired by roll-eating, cake-munching, beer-guzzling conquistadors, it was a necessity for the politically powerful clergy who needed bread to celebrate Mass properly. Repeatedly, Spaniards had tried to grow T. estivum in Hispaniola, and repeatedly it had failed in the hot, humid climate. Garrido's wheat was greeted with joy. In a strange land, it was the taste of home. Soon the golden herringbone tassels of wheat spikelets waved across central Mexico, replacing thousands of acres of maize and woodland. More than that, Mexican smallholders say Spaniards carried Garrido's T. estivum to Texas, from where it spread up the Mississippi. If this is accurate, much or most of the wheat that by the 19th century had transformed the Midwest into an agricultural powerhouse came from an African roadside chapel in Mexico City. In planting Cortez's wheat, Garrido was acting as an agent of the Columbian exchange. More important, though, he himself was part of the exchange, as was Cortez and the other foreigners. Previously in this book, I described researchers' evolving view of the Columbian exchange. I first looked at the Atlantic, where the most important effects were caused by microscopic imports to the Americas. Initially, the diseases that depopulated Indian societies, then malaria and yellow fever, which encouraged plantation slavery. Next, I treated the Pacific, chapters 4 and 5, where the major introductions were American food crops, which both helped sustain a population boom and led indirectly to massive environmental problems. In the next section, which we don't read in this course, chapters 6 and 7, I showed how environmental historians have increasingly come to believe that the Columbian exchange played a role in the agricultural revolution of the 18th century and the industrial revolution of the 19th. Both occurred first in Europe, and so this sociological phenomenon had a large-scale political and economic implication. It fostered the rise of the West. In all this discussion, I have acted as if humankind were in the director's chair, distributing other species at will, sometimes being surprised by the results. But to biologists, Homo sapiens is a species that, like any other, has its own distribution and range. Not only did human beings cause the Columbian exchange, they were buffeted by its currents, a convulsion within our own species that is the subject of this section of the book.